Okay, I'm going to do this video in a way that's similar to the last one. In the last video, we talked about the DSM and its history, and I'm going to do something similar here, but I'm going to talk specifically about how the PTSD diagnosis has evolved in the same time period. And this coincides very much with the history of the DSM and some of the things we talked about last time. It includes some of the same major players. For the schizophrenia readings, I actually went through the DSM reading that I assigned to you a little bit, but I'm not going to do that so much here. I'm going to assume that you read it and that you got a good enough sense of how the DSM frames illness during our schizophrenia discussion. So in this version of the DSM that I assigned to you, printed 33 years after PTSD appeared in an earlier version of the DSM, the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis describes a heterogeneous bundle of symptoms that express differently in different people. However, the introductory chapter of DSM-3, where post-traumatic stress disorder first appeared in the 1980s, reads differently. I'll quote that to you. It says, "The essential feature of this disorder is the development of characteristic symptoms following a psychologically distressing event that's outside of the range of unusual human experience, such as outside the range of experiences like bereavement, chronic illness, business loss, and marital conflict. The stressor producing this syndrome would be markedly stressing to almost anyone and is usually experienced with intense fear, terror, and helplessness. The characteristic symptoms involve re-experiencing the traumatic event, avoidance of stimuli associated with the event, or numbing of general responsiveness and increased arousal. The diagnosis is not made if the disturbance lasts for less than 1 month." And that's from DSM-3. So in DSM-3, post-traumatic stress disorder was thought of as an involuntary set of responses to stimuli that remind a person or trigger a person into feeling that they're re-experiencing a horrific traumatic event. Later in the disorder's description, the DSM explains, and this is still in DSM-3, that PTSD can be understood as something that manifests when a stimulus triggers a person's body or nervous system into believing that they're either re-experiencing the trauma or encountering a similarly threatening scenario. As an example, the DSM suggests that a person who has been assaulted in an elevator may experience a physiological response anytime they enter an elevator. But again, the story of how post-traumatic stress disorder, the diagnosis itself, came to be, along with the changes the diagnosis has undergone in the 4 decades that have passed since it showed up in the DSM for the first time, um, has a lot to do with a lot of social change that's happened in that same time. I'll start in World War I when we have the term shell shock. Shell shock grew out of World War I and was coined by British physicians before the United States entered World War I. They noted that veterans seemed to be psychologically damaged by the war, with confused and disassociated states being the prominent symptom, and physicians theorized that this condition was physiological and was caused by chronic exposure to the concussion of artillery blasts. However, when it was observed that soldiers who were not regularly exposed to explosions were having the same set of symptoms, many military leaders dismissed the diagnosis in its entirety, preferring to ascribe the condition of cowardice or personal weakness to people who showed these symptoms. Sigmund Freud uh, made a contribution to this argument, and he argued that there was a psychological basis to shell shock. This was notable when Freud was consulted as an expert witness in cases where veterans had been mistreated by physicians, World War I veterans. However, Freud's perspective did not find favor within military culture until the later 20th century. When the first edition of the DSM came out in the 1950s, DSM-1, it designated a condition called gross stress reaction, and gross stress reaction was listed as something distinct from neurosis and psychosis, and explained that the symptoms should be expected to fade away in time after the sufferer has not been exposed to something traumatic for long enough. Um, even though there was a lot of research going on at the time that showed that, for example, in the case of Holocaust survivors, that a lot of these traumatic symptoms were going on for many years and decades. And the second DSM, DSM-2, decided to eliminate gross stress reaction. So DSM-2 was the first version of the DSM that had absolutely no reference to anything recognizable as war trauma at all. But the situation of the Vietnam War created many of the conditions that led to the adaptation of the PTSD diagnosis ultimately in DSM-3. In September of 1969, before the news of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam became public, a social worker named Sarah Haley met with a Vietnam War veteran in a Boston VA hospital. The veteran she met with was in a state of extraordinary distress. It was visible, and he told hospital workers that he feared for his life. While he was meeting with Haley and other hospital staff, this veteran described the My Lai massacre in Vietnam in detail. And he described how his unit had slaughtered a group of civilians in a village, and he claimed that he refused to participate in this massacre, but that there were members of his platoon who were threatening to kill him if he ever told anybody what he'd seen. And what basically happened was the clinicians in this Boston VA hospital did not believe the veteran's story at all. They diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia and believed that he was just making the whole thing up. This horrified Haley. She believed the story, and she started a campaign both to take the stories of war veterans seriously and to create the diagnostic possibility of describing the suffering that veterans were having. So she introduced this particular veteran. To a group of people. I'm not going to mention all their names since this is a truncated lesson now. But basically, there was a group of psychiatrists who were working on the notion of war-related trauma. And Haley reached out to them, introduced them to this veteran. They recorded his story, and they all began working together as a kind of a working group in accordance with the group Vietnam Veterans Against the War, to try to make a diagnosis in the DSM that accounts for war trauma a possibility. In 1972, one of these psychiatrists published an article called "The Post-Vietnam Syndrome" in the New York Times, and it got a lot of attention. Another one of these people published a book called "Home from the War" in 1973, which included a bunch of stories, including the veteran that had met with Haley in Boston. And they continued to publish these articles about the suffering that Vietnam War veterans were experiencing, often within the context of atrocities that were committed by the United States in that war. And in that context, they were trying to create social awareness of this set of conditions to make it possible to put it in the DSM. We talked last time about the removal of the homosexuality diagnosis from DSM-2. And the removal of the homosexuality diagnosis was one of the things that really inspired this working group to believe that it would be possible to put a new diagnosis into the DSM. And recognizing the basis for removing homosexuality from the DSM, the fact that the homosexuality diagnosis could not be accounted for with evidence-based medicine, they realized that was the set of tools that they were going to have to use to get PTSD recognized in the DSM. They really doubled down on this in a case where a judge denied a traumatic war neurosis defense that was used by a veteran in court, specifically because there was nothing in the DSM that said that that combat trauma exists as a mental condition. Um, like I described before, the removal of homosexuality from the DSM was controversial and it divided the APA. And in corollary, when advocates of the homosexuality diagnosis replaced it with sexual orientation disturbance, pathologizing non heteronormative sexual orientation. This was seen as a matter of politics being too involved in the DSM process. And it was, of course, Robert Spitzer, who we talked about last time, who developed really strong feelings about how this needed to happen. So, because of the political backlash and complexity that was involved in the APA's attempt to delist, or Spitzer's attempt to delist homosexuality from the DSM, Spitzer ended up becoming very, very hard to convince about anything really. When people started coming to Spitzer, when they started working on the DSM-3 and wanting to add various new diagnoses to it, his standards were very high, and he was a very difficult person to convince about those kinds of things. We talked already about Kraepelinian analysis, so I'm going to not talk about that so much right now. In 1975, the working group that I told you about before approached Spitzer and requested that a subcommittee be created to consider post-Vietnam syndrome as a diagnosis in DSM-3. Spitzer just outright rejected them at first. He eventually reconsidered this and said that he would consider forming this subcommittee if compelling scientific data could be produced that showed that post-combat disorder met the standards of Kraepelinian analysis. Spitzer noted that work by other contemporary psychiatrists argued that the suffering experienced by Vietnam War veterans could all be classified under other extant diagnoses in the DSM, such as depression and anxiety disorders and things like that. So at the time, Spitzer felt he wasn't saying that the suffering of Vietnam War veterans wasn't real, but he didn't believe that it was anything that was specific to combat. They were all things that could be attributed to other mental mental disorders. An important part of the working group's strategy became to expand the diagnosis beyond combat to include trauma more generally. So then they started recruiting other people who worked in other kinds of trauma, some people who worked with Holocaust survivors, people who worked with the survivors of severe burns, people who worked on the survivors of severe disasters, natural disasters, all became involved in this process to try to create a bigger trauma-based diagnosis that was not necessarily combat specific, but would include and account for the experience of trauma of just about any kind. They were successful in this, and post-traumatic stress disorder appeared in DSM-3 when it was published in 1980. But in 1987, DSM-3R came out. I talked about before how the DSM sometimes gets revised within a particular edition. DSM-R came out in 1987 due to the concern that the original 1980 listing was still too unscientific, listing miscellaneous symptoms, not sufficiently demonstrating the biomedical connection between the traumatic experience and the symptoms that were being experienced. So the 1987 edition of the DSM made it absolutely explicit that PTSD symptoms, other than flashbacks and avoidance behaviors, absolutely must be understood as being derived from physiological arousal responses to triggers. And likewise, though guilt had been mentioned, guilt itself was mentioned as a diagnostic criterion in the 1980 version of DSM-3. The 1987 version, DSM-3R, deemed guilt to be an associated feature, but not a symptom of PTSD. So the demands of the APA, along with the particular sociopolitical context of the Vietnam War, constructed this PTSD disease as something that could only be legitimately understood as a cluster of symptoms connected to a specific traumatic event through neurological pathways. The extant diagnoses that post war suffering had been attributed to prior to the establishment of the PTSD diagnosis, such as depressive disorders and substance abuse disorders, in this process became things that were themselves no longer able to be compensated for by the government because they could not be proven to be service connected. So that's sort of a caveat that while this team was working to try to make PTSD something that could be seen as legitimate um, and something that was not these other disorders, depression and substance abuse and that sort of thing. Their success in making PTSD a recognized service connected mental disorder uh, made it no longer possible for people who were experiencing things like depression and substance abuse disorders. Um, they could no longer have those things treated as service connected. And sometimes before the PTSD diagnosis came out, they could be. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the Beyond PTSD chapter that I assigned you by Hausinger and Scanlon. I'm going to frame the field work they were doing a little bit since I only assigned you one chapter and you didn't get this part. Um, the study that they were doing in the book that I took this from, these two anthropologists were studying a unit that was returning from Iraq to Fort Carson, Colorado. Their original research interest was the barriers experienced by soldiers and veterans who were in the pursuit of various kinds of care, help after war. But as they started doing their field work, they were doing interviews with these soldiers as they were returning from their deployment. There ended up being a massive increase in violent crime around Fort Carson that was associated with this unit. In other words, there started to be a lot of assaults, rapes, and murders that were committed by the soldiers of this unit after they returned home. This increased the sense by these researchers who wrote this book that the PTSD diagnosis did not go far enough to describe what these soldiers were experiencing. In the book's title, Beyond PTSD, they signal their thesis to us, which is, of course, that the umbrella term PTSD is used to conflate nowadays a wide range of sufferings and behaviors that are experienced by war veterans. They note at the beginning of the chapter that one issue is that of deservedness. Soldiers who are seen as suffering from PTSD are seen as deserving sympathy and help in ways that soldiers who are suffering from financial difficulties or marital problems are not seen as legitimate. And that sort of goes back to what we were talking about before, where there were a lot of different problems that people would have when they came back from the Vietnam War. And the creation of the PTSD diagnosis kind of made that the one single way that people could understand problems that soldiers have after war as being legitimate or something that we should care about or help them with. Um, the difference in the PTSD diagnosis between what was framed in DSM 3 and especially 3R as a very, very biomedical condition to the much more complex assignment that I gave you to read, the contemporary DSM 5 version of PTSD, has again become very, very complex. This is due to what we call diagnosis creep. And this is something that Hausinger and Scanlon are worried about. Diagnosis creep is a term that I'd like you to know. It refers to the tendency for the definition of a condition or disease to expand over time to include more and more and more things that it did not account for before. The authors recognize that a very common argument, and this is one that I used to also feel very, very early in my own research. A very common argument is that our society is lacking in rituals to bring soldiers home. In other words, a common narrative that still exists. I hear it all the time among the veterans I work with, and I see it in my own research. It's very common. A very common narrative is that we prepare soldiers for war. We send them to war, we bring them home, and then we dump them into society with no kinds of processing or any rituals to help them adjust to life after war. Hausinger and Scanlon observe in their field work that in reality there are a whole lot of things that are available for veterans in terms of ritual, and a lot of those things get explored in the chapter that I assigned to you. They note um, that psychiatry in the military seems to be founded on a kind of contradiction. Um, Psychiatrists who are working within the context of the military have to, at the same time, A, protect the mental health of soldiers, and B, maintain the fighting force. In other words, there is an inherent conflict between the needs of the military and the obligation that physicians have to protect and treat the health of people. They have to take care of these soldiers and these veterans at the same time that the military is also expecting them to continue sending them to war and to continue maintaining what in the military we called readiness. The readiness of a unit is its ability to deploy people to do whatever the military is being asked to do. The authors also note that enlisted military service, which accounts for the majority of people who serve in the military, rarely leads to upward social mobility in the way that it did in the past. If we were in class together, I would talk a little bit more about what that means. I don't know how familiar those of you in this class are with the notion of the divide between enlisted service members and commissioned service members or officers. There's a significant difference in how these people experience life in the military. There's a major class difference. Um, People who are officers in the military tend to get out and have you know much less precarity than is experienced by people who are enlisted in the military. Um, Noting this difference, what Hausinger and Scanlon are trying to do, noting that enlisted soldiers are much more likely to have problems after the military than officers, highlights the reality that the list of things that contribute to post-war suffering in veterans tend to be well outside the range of PTSD nosology. So, in the sake of time and our current circumstances, I'm going to just kind of skim through or not really go very deeply into the various forms of alternative therapy that are utilized around Fort Carson that are talked about in this chapter. The primary thing that I wanted you to get from that reading was that the diversity of treatments that are offered for combat trauma, and additionally how far away some of them are from DSM standardization practices, there's a lot there. It's very diverse. Does this mean that people really are or are not suffering from PTSD? This is a very complicated question. I'm not going to tell you what you should believe about that, but it is a question that these readings are asking us to consider. So I'm going to transition here into the notion of moral injury, which is something that Hausinger and Scanlon talk about a little bit at the end of their chapter. And I talk about it in the segment of the web article, my article that I wrote that I assigned part of for you to read. I want you to know the name Jonathan Shea. Shea was a psychiatrist and classics scholar, or is, he's still around. But he worked as a physician in a veterans center, treating veterans of the Vietnam War. And he came to the conclusion that many people he was treating, and he published this in the 1990s, that a lot of these people, even though they were diagnosed with PTSD, they were suffering from something else. And drawing from some parallels that he observed in Homeric epics, Shea coined the term moral injury to describe this suffering. In the 21st century, this term has made kind of a comeback. It's been appropriated by a lot of people, though I want to be clear to you that the use of this term is contested and is applied differently by a lot of different people. I've spoken to a lot of these people. I know some of them, and they all define this term differently. I've asked Dr. Shea about this directly, and I want to be very clear about both what he was referring to when he came up with this term and the different ways that people use it now. When Shea coined the term moral injury, he was describing a form of suffering that occurs when socially accepted norms about what is right are violated, right and wrong, ethical things. With his Vietnam War veteran patients, what he was referring to overwhelmingly was the experience of having those norms violated on a systemic level. What I mean by this is that veterans who were morally injured were suffering because the government or their commanders or other institutions committed bad acts in war or ordered these veterans to do so themselves. As I described this in my article, this is not necessarily what people mean today when they use the term moral injury. This term is being used to describe suffering that's associated with a much more personal kind of wrongdoing rather than the wrongdoing of institutions. I'll give some examples, but I'm not requiring you to remember these names. A group of clinicians, uh, prominently including Brett Litz, utilize this moral injury term to describe personal wrongdoing um, that's a violation of personal notions of right and wrong. Like an individual does something, they become morally injured because they did something that they believe was wrong to do in their own personal constitution. Um, Therefore, it's not necessarily culturally mediated. It could be, but it's personal. Another scholar is Rita Nakashima Brock. She uses this term moral injury to describe personal or institutional wrongdoing that violates things that are just universally or categorically wrong. In other words, this is not necessarily a culturally mediated sense of right and wrong, but it's more of a universal human response to things that we do that are wrong per se. For example, I think she would argue that someone who's been exposed to something like slavery or genocide may have this experience of moral injury afterwards, regardless of whether or not their culture has decided that those things are right or wrong. They're categorically wrong. We as humans know that they're wrong, and we could expect people to have this moral injury experience after encountering or participating in those things, either as a uh, person who suffered it or who perpetuated it. For my part, I'm not telling you what to believe about the moral injury term. What I'm telling you is that it is a relatively new term that has developed and is, as of today, still being debated, sort of like PTSD was in the 1970s. However, there is increasing consensus among everyone that the very medicalized PTSD diagnosis does not adequately describe the kinds of problems that are affecting and surrounding war veterans. In the article that I wrote, I tried to show that there is a generational difference in the way that this suffering is experienced. I think it corresponds in a lot of ways with the different framings of moral injury in the different eras, like we talked about. We see, for example, in that article, the case of the contemporary Iraq War veteran who says, basically, "I'm suffering because the thing that I did was bad," and him being corrected by a Vietnam War veteran who is telling him basically, whether or not the thing that you did was bad is not your responsibility. You had to go to war. It wasn't your choice. You're not responsible for these bad things. Those sins are the responsibility of somebody above you. I think that there's some correlation generationally with that. And I want you to take from this article that the way that trauma itself is imagined, or rather what trauma is even understood to be, is something that's changed profoundly through the years. We already talked about how during the Vietnam War era, war trauma emerged as something biomedical, which allowed institutional and social legitimacy for sufferers who were previously seen as weaklings for having suffered at all. However, there was a period that emerged in the 1980s and 90s, what we kind of refer to as, or tend to refer to as, the culture wars. I'm not sure how familiar those of you in this class are with this term. You might be really familiar with it, or you might not be. But just to visit that term, the culture wars came about. There's a combination of A, losing the Vietnam War, and B, the sense by many people, but primarily conservative Christian white men, that social gains that were associated um, with people who made social gains during the civil rights movement, feminism, LGBTQ movements, these things that happened in the 20th century, had not only degraded their own hegemonic power and status in society, but that these things were also leading to large scale social collapse. This ultimately led to a massive cultural backlash from segments of conservative and right wing America. And this is, generally speaking, what we're referring to when we're talking about the culture wars. This is relevant to us because the culture wars reconfigured notions of things like, why do people fight in wars? What is being defended when people fight in wars? And what even is the suffering that's experienced by people after war? A prominent example, probably the most prominent example that you get culturally, is what you see in the Rambo movies. Especially in the first one, the protagonist is a Vietnam War veteran with PTSD. As you watch this film, you get the sense that his suffering is the result not only of biomedical combat trauma per se, as was described in the DSM, but the domestic social collapse that the conservative side of the culture wars believed to be occurring in our society. This narrative has powerfully reconfigured the way that combat trauma is imagined in the public consciousness, especially by people who experience it in contemporary wars. There's an increasing sense that the trauma experienced by people who have fought in wars is something else entirely from the trauma experienced by civilians who have PTSD from something like a car accident. Um, I was going to talk a little bit more about trauma theory itself, but due to our circumstances, I'm going to let that go. Um, so we're a little over 30 minutes here, and that's as far as I wanted to go on this video for today. So pay attention to the terms. I'm going to post those for you with the things that I really want you to understand from this. Take care. I'll see you soon.